Like most retro consoles, the Sega Genesis gives you almost total control over the hardware. Your game has to be capable of booting up and initializing the system itself before you start actually loading the game. However, in all but the earliest Genesis models, your game's ROM isn't actually what gets run first. Instead, there's another ROM built into the console, which is part of the TradeMark security system, or TMSS, which gets run before your game. This system is one of the security measures Sega took to prevent unlicensed games from being made for their console, which we'll be talking about in this video. So let's talk about how we can bypass the security in the Sega Genesis when making homebrew games. Now, before we get to the TMSS, let's quickly talk about another security measure which at first sounds like a huge pain, but actually ends up being a complete non-issue: the checksum. So the first 256 bytes of every Sega Genesis game are data which is required for the CPU to function, and this data isn't specified by Sega, it's actually part of the design of the CPU itself. The next 256 bytes are the cartridge ID table, which I've also heard referred to as the cartridge header or the ROM header. And most of the data here isn't strictly required for your game to work, but Sega did require you to fill it out correctly before they would give their stamp of approval for you to publish your game. Now, one of the entries in the header is the checksum, and as the name would imply, this is just the sum of all of the data in the cartridge after the header itself. Code, data, anything else on the cartridge, it all gets added together, and that's the checksum. So the idea is the developers would calculate this checksum before publishing the game and include it in the cartridge header. Then it's up to the game to run the calculation again to find out the checksum, compare it to the checksum that's stored in the cartridge header, and if it doesn't match, that means that the game's ROM has been tampered with, so the game can respond by locking up at that point. Now, notice how it is in fact the game's responsibility to do this. There's nothing built into the console itself which will validate the checksum. Back in the day, of course, if you were to try to publish a game that didn't check this checksum, Sega would have rejected it. But as homebrew developers, we can just ignore it. Moving on, so the thing you really need to worry about as a homebrew developer is the trademark security system, or TMSS, that I mentioned earlier. Now, there are two components to the TMSS. There's a software lockout and a hardware lockout. On the software side of things is the ROM I mentioned earlier that gets executed before your game does. So the way it works is the system is configured in such a way that when it first boots up, the CPU doesn't actually see your game's ROM at the beginning of its memory. It sees this TMSS ROM instead, and this boot ROM contains a program which will check your game's cartridge ID table, and specifically it looks for the 4 ASCII characters Sega in all caps at the very beginning of the ID table. For North America it says Sega Genesis, for outside North America it says Sega Mega Drive, but all that actually really matters for the system to work is the word Sega at the very beginning. If it's there, the TMSS ROM will display the words produced by or under license from Sega Enterprises Limited, and then transfer control over to your game. Otherwise, you'll just get a black screen and the system will not attempt to execute any of your game's code. So this Sega string is really the only thing in the cartridge ID table which is absolutely necessary for the game to function properly. But it is a good idea to fill out the rest of it as accurately as possible, because some emulators will actually use this information to do stuff like display your game's name in the window title, or determine if your game is meant for NTSC or PAL consoles, for example. Now, moving on to the hardware side of things, this is the video display processor. It's a processor which displays video, and as you could imagine, that's pretty important for video games. So it would be a shame if we couldn't use it, right? Well, so the TMSS will actually lock you out of accessing the VDP at all unless you perform a very specific procedure before you attempt to access the VDP for the first time. The first thing you need to do is check the hardware version that your game is currently running on by reading the byte and address A10001 and isolating the lowest 4 bits. Now, if the version is 0, then it's actually one of the early Sega Genesis models that doesn't have the TMSS present, so you're actually supposed to skip the next step. And if the version is 1 or higher, then you need to write the ASCII string Sega in all caps to the address A14000. And this is where it actually becomes pretty cool that Sega happens to have a 4-letter company name, because each ASCII character is 1 byte, which means this is a 32-bit value, which a 68K CPU is capable of transferring to and from memory in a single instruction. Now keep in mind, if the hardware version is 0, Sega specifically says you're supposed to skip the step where you write Sega to that other memory address, so you probably shouldn't just make your game always do it. Now, if you don't do this procedure, you'll still see the produced by or under license from Sega message, because obviously the boot ROM doesn't know whether your game is going to perform this procedure or not. But if you don't perform the procedure, then your game will never be able to display anything other than a black screen, because the first time you try to access the VDP, it'll lock up the system. Now, the reason why Sega chose to actually use their company name for both aspects of this procedure is actually very deliberate. Since you need to include the ASCII string Sega in your ROM to bypass the TMSS, if an unauthorized game were to do this, then in theory they would be infringing on Sega's trademark, hence it being called the trademark security system. This did not hold up in court. So yeah, as a homebrew developer, the checksum literally doesn't matter and the TMSS is trivial to bypass, but it is important to be aware of if you're making a homebrew game before you try to test it on real hardware. Now, most emulators obviously don't do this check, but if you want to use an emulator which actually will enforce the TMSS so you know that your game will work on real hardware, then I recommend using an emulator called Exodus, which is highly accurate, more accurate than an emulator needs to be to just play games, and that's because it's made for homebrew developers. And if you want to check out my homebrew Sega Genesis game, go to polymino.net/downloads to download the Genesis ROM, or you can search Polymino on Steam to find the PC version, which is currently in early access. See you next time.